Vice presidential debates tend to be less than memorable.
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking. I'm speaking.
Then Senator Kamala Harris's shutdown of VP Mike Pence got some attention in 2020, but not nearly as much as the fly that landed on Pence's head that debate. And in a toss-up 2024 race, will a debate by the number twos make a difference in determining who comes out number one in November? Good evening and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Esme Murphy. On October 1st, two men fighting for the job that puts them a heartbeat away from the presidency will take the debate stage in New York City. They will be making the case not just for themselves, but for their presidential candidates. Before being named to national tickets, neither of these candidates was well known outside their home states. Governor Tim Walz, despite his 12 years in Congress and 6 years as governor, had little of a national profile. Vance did have a recognition edge, having written a best-selling memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, that was later turned into a movie about his difficult childhood in Appalachia. Polls show Vance has had a rockier national rollout than Walz. A recent USA Today poll found 48% of likely voters viewed Walz favorably and 36% viewed him unfavorably. That's compared to 37% who see Vance favorably to 49% who see him unfavorably. Vance faced off in several primary and general election debates in Ohio's 2022 Senate race. Walz, running for re-election as governor in 2022, agreed to only one debate. Tonight, we will preview the vice presidential showdown. Let's start with political analyst Larry Jacobs. Well, joining us right now is Humphrey School professor Larry Jacobs. Thank you so much, Professor, for coming on.
Good to be with you.
All right, the vice presidential debate. Give us some perspective historically. What does this mean? And what does this mean for JD Vance and Tim Walz?
This is a huge moment. The race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump is basically a toss-up at this point. You got a lot of folks kind of, teasing out what the polls are saying, but the polls are saying toss-up. And the race is within the statistical margin of error nationally, and then when you go into the so-called battleground states. So a strong performance next week by either Vance or Walz could make a small difference and tip the election. They're going to have tens of millions of people watching them, perhaps a bit less than the Trump-Kamala Harris debate, but a huge opportunity for one of the candidates to tilt the election.
And so you're saying it's because it's so close that something little that might not have made a difference in years past could make a difference this time.
Exactly. We have had moments in the vice presidential debates where the so-called undercard surprises, and it becomes kind of a theme for the rest of the campaign. You can't predict that, but this could be a fiery debate. You've got two candidates who've been circling each other for the last month or so, and they've been laying out some very harsh lines of attack. I expect that to continue.
It's interesting when you look at approval ratings. JD Vance's are really in the tank. Tim Walz's aren't. It's not that he's that has high a favorability rating, but he actually has a higher favorability rating than I believe Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, or JD Vance. What's going on there?
Well, Tim Walz had one of the greatest introductions as a candidate. First of all, he came on the national scene with very little political scar tissue. He was not well known. And so when he was welcomed as a coach, as a kind of school teacher, as a kind of regular guy, it really hit a spot. And I think with a wide number of Americans. So that was extraordinary. Whereas you look at the other politicians, they've been around the block, they've been beaten up, they've got plenty of scar tissue.
Right, but JD Vance, JD Vance's upbringing is just as, if not more difficult, than what Tim Walz had. Tim Walz had what appears to be a loving childhood with some really difficult, tough times in Nebraska. But JD Vance was born into what sounds like abject poverty in Appalachia. Yet somehow JD Vance has been niched into this elitist mold. Is that just clever work by the Democrats, or what's happening there?
Well, partly I think the Democrats have done a number on JD Vance, but JD Vance, as Tim Walz has been saying, went to Yale. He's been working as an investor banker, and he doesn't fit the mold of an authentic Midwesterner, whereas Tim Walz is presenting himself born, raised in Nebraska, school teacher, military, the National Guard. He's just laying out a more kind of familiar biography, and it's stuck.
You know, the Republicans have been really trying to tar and feather Tim Walz over his military record, claiming that he left the National Guard at a time just before his unit was going to be deployed to Iraq. They've been hot and heavy with this criticism. It doesn't seem to have registered at all. Is this sort of a false path that the Republicans are going down? Because you know it's going to come up again at this debate.
It could well come up again. The facts on Tim Walz's record are pretty strong. He served for over 2 decades. He did come out of the National Guard just before deployment to Iraq, but it was to run for Congress rather than to kind of skip out on his colleagues. So I think, it makes it more complicated. JD Vance did serve as a Marine. He did go to Iraq, and so that's a stronger record. It's been a little difficult.
He was a journalist. I mean, Walz has fired back saying, I applaud anybody who served and everybody who served. Thank you for your service. It almost seems like the way Walz has handled it has played better than what Republicans are trying to say about him.
Yeah, I don't think this has been a score territory. I think the main focus of JD Vance's debate performance is going to be on Minnesota. It's going to be in Tim Walz as a governor and as a proven radical liberal. And they're going to be able to point to, sky high spending, new programs, legislation that has allowed undocumented or immigrants to get driver's licenses. All of that is going to become part of the JD Vance attack. It's very telling that Congressman Tom Emmer from Minnesota is playing the Walz character in the debate practice for Vance. So to me, Minnesota is going to be in the national stage, and we may well take a black eye.
Well, it'll be interesting to see. Thank you so much, Larry Jacobs. Always a pleasure to have your insights.
Good to be on with you.
Up next, Republican analyst Amy Koch. Joining us right now is Republican analyst Amy Koch. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
From the Republican perspective, what are you looking for in this debate between JD Vance and Tim Walz?
Right. Well, I mean, what an exciting night we've got coming up, right? Has anyone prepared so much for a vice presidential debate? I bet there'll be parties all over Minnesota watching.
Yes, they will.
But, there will, right? So this is going to be a very interesting debate. A lot of eyes on. There has been, JD Vance has been in the news a lot lately for, being awkward, being stiff versus Governor Walz, who's gotten a lot of kudos for sort of his authentic, regular dad coach self. And so it is going to be very interesting to see Vance, like how he'll be able to push some issues and push some buttons while also still maintaining, a comfortable, easy, get to know you level. Because I don't feel like America knows JD Vance yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, a lot of them don't know Tim Walz, too.
No, and that's true, but he kind of hit with fire, right? And JD Vance has been getting a bad rap, whether it's right or not. He's been kind of the attack dog for Trump, which I never understand why you need that. I would very much humanize JD Vance. I would talk about his beautiful family. I would talk about his life in the military. I would talk about his rags to riches upbringing. You have the ultimate attack dog in Trump. You don't need another attack dog in JD Vance. So I hope he gets into the issues, and I hope he speaks really eloquently about what he and the administration would do moving forward. We'll see, and shows us a little human side to him.
I saw one poll that showed that Kamala Harris had a 33% advantage with women, that the Walz-Harris ticket had that kind of an advantage with women. And JD Vance has been out there making some comments that have gotten a lot of pushback, is a generous word, from
rightfully so, by the way.
You're a Republican. The trialist cat ladies suggesting women without children somehow are in a different category. What are Republican women? Because they're a big group, they're not a monolith, and people are. I know that Republicans are concerned about not only holding them but expanding the percentage of Republicans and women that vote for the ticket.
Yeah, well, pushing women out of the Republican Party is a losing formula for Republicans. I don't think I have to tell anyone that. We are just over 50% of the population, and we vote a lot. So I think that that Vance is going to have to make some amends there and make some strides there. And I think part of that is showing that he's human. And I think part of it is I suspect that he's going to answer some questions in the debate about that. And when you've got women in your own party saying, what are you doing? Like, I am saying that it was out of line, it was wrongheaded, and it was just plain stupid. And you sound out of touch and old fashioned, and frankly, not who's somebody that I would like to support. So he's going to have to come back from that, and he's going to answer for it.
At the end of the day, though, do you think a vice presidential debate, really moves the needle?
Well, ordinarily, I would say no. Ordinarily, I would say this is just, something for very much political insiders. But the vice presidential candidates have been in the spotlight far more, particularly Vance. And I think that's right, given Trump's advanced age. I think that's something that people have to sort of keep in the back of their minds. And the other thing is, in a vacuum, and boy, has it been quiet on the vice presidential Harris, former President Trump's landscape in the last week and a half, right? No one's really doing interviews. No one's really out there. This is kind of the next thing that people are looking forward to. I'm not sure the strategy is going to work for either of those camps to keep everybody quiet. I don't think it's the right strategy. But I think in sort of that vacuum, this vice presidential debate is going to have impact.
How about the mantra, do no harm? In other words, don't screw up. How important is that?
Well, I mean, that's a big part of this, right? When we saw, honestly, President Trump really, he had clearly prepared more than he had in normal debates. But he had just some monumental faltering, particularly when it came to the question of immigration. And when you ask people what they think about that debate, everyone talks about, well, they're eating dogs. Right. That's the thing that came out of it. And so that goes into this, like, do no harm. Right. Had a lot of his answers were actually correct on foreign policy and the economy. I think he had stronger answers. But it was completely overshadowed by those
eating
really
cats and dogs.
Big, right. By some really ridiculous statements.
So is that something that they have to guard against? I mean, especially Vance, who's been prone to suggestions or topics and statements that seem just out of touch.
Right. Well, again, he's got to show us his human side. Because some of those interviews that they're quoting, right, they took place when he was very, I don't know what he was thinking, and he was comfortable, and he was giving ridiculous interviews. But there's been stuff on the trail, like him buying donuts, or a question from a reporter that said, what makes you happy? And then he's like, well, I'll tell you what makes me sad or whatever, angry is what Kamala Harris is doing. Like, he has been this cartoonish character. He's been acting somebody, and you can sense that it's not his authentic self. And I would just very much encourage him, those who are working with him. And I hear our own Congressman Emmer is working with him. And I would say, let us get to know him. Let us get to know the person. Stop being this like attack dog cartoon person.
Yeah, that's right. And Congressman Tom Emmer apparently playing Tim Walz in the practice debates with JD Vance. I'd love to be a fly.
I'd love to see that debate.
In that one. All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Amy Koch.
Yeah, thanks, Esme.
Up next, Democratic analyst Abou Amara. Joining us right now, Democratic analyst Abou Amara. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Esme.
All right, the vice presidential debate. What do both candidates have to do?
Yeah, I think this is an important debate for both of them. JD Vance is going to be a skilled debater. I think we saw that in the Ohio Senate races. On the other hand, Tim Walz, this is his first debate at the national level. And so I think if you're Tim Walz, you really want to make this a beer versus wine debate. And what I mean by that is Tim Walz is a everyday regular guy. He's got to communicate in that way to reach some of those independents in the blue wall. and really contrast JD Vance as both extreme and elite. And I think you saw some of those contrasts earlier in the campaign when Tim Walz was announced. And so I think that's the contrast Tim Walz wants to make. And if he can do that effectively, I think he can come out on top.
You know, that's such an interesting point and a great line too, beer versus wine. But I think they've been successful, the Democrats have been, in framing the debate as a beer versus wine guy, beer guy versus wine guy. But Vance was born in poverty in rural Appalachia. I mean, if anything, he's the one who has that background, yet he did go to Yale Law School. Can he really continue? Can't he stake that claim for himself that he's the ultimate beer guy?
JD Vance, he should make that argument. He should make his rags to riches story and talk about how he came from poverty and ultimately got to where he is. I just think that contrast is going to be a bit disingenuous. Remember, most folks who come from small towns don't end up working at hedge funds, pushing around hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And so again, I think the contrast for Tim Walz is going to say, I am like you, I am fighting on your side. That's the contrast the Democrats want to be on in this debate.
Okay. Realistically, though, does this make a difference in terms of the outcome of the election?
Yeah, I don't think this is going to decide the election. What I do think, though, is that it's an entry point, another opportunity to reach independent, moderate-leaning voters in that blue wall. Remember, we're not going to have a series of debates, 3 or 4 of them more before Election Day. This could be the last debate of this entire election cycle. And so from that standpoint, you want to provide an opportunity to reach those independents, again, in that blue wall that are going to be critical. And I've seen polling that suggests that Tim Walz, with some demographics, polls more favorable than Kamala Harris. And so with those voters, you're hoping he can reach that group of voters.
Which demographics are those?
Yep. So these are infrequent, moderate voters, right? Within the blue wall who are middle-aged. There are some voters in that sliver of the universe that Tim Walz, at least in terms of what they know about him, they're more favorable. Again, not many voters know Tim Walz. He's still unknown relative to the other candidates, but he does poll well with those folks. And this is an opportunity to raise that name ID and to be able to try to reach those voters.
Well, infrequent voters, those are just the people that both parties need. They need to get the people who are not in the polls, who are maybe unlikely to vote, and then decide they are going to vote. I mean, that's what Donald Trump did in 2016, surprising everyone. And polling-wise, in terms of, favorability, Tim Walz is ahead of JD Vance in every single poll that I've seen.
That's exactly right. And that's why his favorability, he has a great opportunity to build on that foundation. Most Americans know, or more Americans know JD Vance. He's underwater on his favorability. That speaks to the beer versus wine dynamic I'm talking about. JD Vance feels out of touch. He feels like he's talking about extreme things. He's talking about cats and dogs. He's talking about women and marriage. Tim Walz is talking about voters and what they want. And I think if Tim Walz can double down on that lead he has over JD Vance, again, it's not going to decide the entire election, but it's more points you can put up on the scoreboard that ultimately will contribute to whether you're going to win in November or not.
I've seen it said that in terms of a vice presidential pick, the most important thing is do no harm. And to a certain extent, Vance's ratings and favorability ratings are so poor, and some of his comments, like the cat ladies running the single cat ladies running the country, have gotten so much negative publicity. One wonders if his selection has not hurt Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think in some ways it just doubles down on what Donald Trump has already been saying anyway, right? I mean, Donald Trump going as far back as 2016 said he could grab women and do whatever he wants. This is just a continuation of a lot of that messaging. So it's really kind of taking Donald Trump and then putting it on steroids, if you will. And so again, that ticket has a problem with women. That ticket has a problem with suburban folks. And I think Tim Walz has displayed, at least in Minnesota, that is one part of his constituency that he does fairly well with.
I actually interviewed Tim Walz after the first presidential debate between Biden and Trump. And Walz said at that point, when he was nowhere near in consideration for vice presidential candidate, he said, well, I'm not a good debater either. Looking back, he debated in 2018 on Almanac, and then in 2022, he debated at a Rochester station. He has not done a lot of big-time debates, even within the state of Minnesota. Is that a concern for him?
Yeah, so to me, there's no question here that JD Vance is a very skilled debater. We saw it in the Ohio Senate races. Tim Walz, this is new to him. This is not something he has done. And you know, if I were his team, I'd be advising kind of similar to how they handled the teleprompter situation. He had never really used a teleprompter. You just have to anchor him for days on end in debate prep. And I suspect they've been in debate prep probably for a week or two already. And you really have to anchor him in the policy and the issues, and then tightening the message. You know, Tim Walz is a very outgoing, gregarious guy, but often that means you're not always as message disciplined as you need to be. And so this debate, I think, is really going to be about how message disciplined can Tim Walz be taking the affirmative case. You know, you can talk about here or there where they're, you know, the other side is lying or making things up, but Tim Walz has to have an affirmative case that is disciplined, that is tight, that shows he is ready to be on the national stage, and I suspect he can do that.
All right. Well, Abou Amara, thank you so much. Always great to hear your input.
Thanks for having me, Esme.
And that does it for this edition of Talking Points. As always, feel free to email me at esme@cbs.com with any comments and suggestions. The show streams on CBS News Minnesota, which is always free on Wednesday and Thursday nights at 6:30 and 9:30 p.m. On Friday, the show posts to YouTube for on-demand viewing. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Esme Murphy, WCCO News.